Need audio? Everyone? Everybody have a little case of spring fever this morning? I feel good. I'm Joanne Bunge, and the Planning Committee and I welcome you to the Bucket Courses Open Wednesday lecture this morning. If you will take a moment to silence your cell phones and turn on the tea coil, we'll be ready to go. A week from today, Professor Emeritus of Classics at Grinnell College will be giving the first of his 3 classes in his lecture. Jerry Lalonde will be teaching on writing, history of the technology, beginning next week. And I've asked him to come and give you a little preview of it so that you are all ready for next week. Professor Lalonde.
I don't think I need this. Right, I'm very happy to be here. I will give 3 lectures on the history of writing as a technology. In an age and a culture where most of us read and write, it's easy to take writing for granted, but it has a very interesting history. I will talk about the definition of writing and trace the development of this technology from its beginning in the late 4th millennium BC right up until modern time, featuring writing systems of the ancient Sumerians in Mesopotamia, the Egyptians, the Semites, writing system of the Minoans of ancient Crete, Bronze Age Crete, and Bronze Age Greece, the development of the first true alphabet in the Greek, borrowing from Phoenician writing. And then we'll trace the history of the alphabet right up to modern times, talk about some of the manipulations and variations and attempts to reform writing and what is the future of writing. Also, writing is often a highly politicized issue, and I'll say something about those political issues. Some of them are as small as the way the type that is used in writing, and literacy itself is often a highly political issue in history. So I think mass literacy is a very recent, a very modern phenomenon, and writing itself is very late in human history. So I think you will find it an interesting subject. I'll also, along the way, talk about some of the materials and methods of writing. Thank you.
I bet you didn't even know that there was that much to know about writing. There are still some seats left for next week, and you can sign up on the table in the hallway if you haven't signed up already. But this morning, Cynthia Hansen is here today. You have invited her back with all of your requests to the Planning Committee, and even though she is an active faculty member, she has made time in her schedule to come and visit with us again. So I'm delighted to introduce you the second time to Professor Cynthia Hansen, who is Assistant Professor of Linguistics at Grinnell College, and she will be lecturing on Dead or Alive, Language in the 21st Century. I'm so happy to welcome back Cynthia Hansen.
Good morning. Good morning. We wanted to do a little sound check while the room was still. Good? Thumbs up in the back.
Good.
Great. I also got feedback last time that I was too loud, which is normal for me. Most people say that I am too loud. And so if that is the case, we can also adjust on the wall. And I am consciously standing up here saying, use your normal voice, Cynthia, use your normal voice. Don't project. Especially if we have the Well, when I get really excited, it will get louder, I promise. So, this morning as I was getting ready, I was thinking in true academic fashion that I needed to introduce myself, who I am, and why I am qualified to talk to you today. That's what academics do. They introduce themselves with their set of qualifications. And in thinking about that, I was kind of like, really, the goal of today is to present a persuasive argument. So really, I'm going to do that, but I'm going to couch it in why I am passionate about this topic and why I find this lecture to be particularly important. My name is Cynthia Hansen. I am a linguist by training. I have my PhD in linguistics from the University of Texas at Austin. But I have been working on language documentation and endangered languages since I was in college, and maybe even a little bit before. My parents teased me that I was a linguist starting at age 3. When my dad was leaving on a business trip and I asked him where he was going, and he said he was going to Miami, and I reported back to my mom that he was going to his Ammy. Now that I have a 3-year-old myself, I see that linguist gene pervasive through her own linguistic analysis. She comes home at least one day a week from daycare and she says, Mommy, Luke at school, he doesn't say twacto the way I say twacto. So she's paying attention to how things are pronounced. And she always corrects me whenever I have a speech error. So it is detectable at an early age. When I was in college, actually, as a senior in high school, I discovered the field of linguistics in a mathematics course. I was taking it was a math class for seniors that they didn't quite know what to do with. We had done calculus in our junior year, and they realized, senior year, what are we going to do with them? Because calculus is usually what they do in the senior year. So the teacher asked us to write a paper about how mathematics was related to our intended college major. And at the time, I thought that I was going to do something with German or Russian, because I was taking German. In high school, I had also started Russian, and that was what I liked the most, and that's what I was going to do in college. So I went to the teacher and I said, what should I write my paper about? Because I'm not really sure how German and Russian relate to math. And she said, well, why don't you write about a German mathematician or a Russian mathematician? That would be a good connection. And I thought, that sounds so boring. No offense to the mathematicians in the room. My best friend's mom worked at AT&T Bell Labs in New Jersey as a physicist, and her colleague was a mathematical linguist, and I was telling her about this paper assignment, and she said, you should talk to someone I work with. She's a mathematical linguist. She would know how these two things connect. Sure enough, she sent me a paper that I still to this day have not read. It was very dense technical jargon. I didn't understand what it was about, but I took the bibliography, the references at the end, and I went to the computers in our town library, the value of a public library, and I looked up the authors, and I found that there was this thing called linguistics that matched linguistic or analytical ability with language study. And I was like, oh, this is me right here. This is exactly what I have wanted to do my whole life. I didn't know such a thing existed, but this is exactly me. This is my skill set. I can analyze pretty well, and I like languages a lot. And linguistics looks at them all. So yes, this is me. I want to go to college and do linguistics. Except I had already applied to college, and half the programs I had applied to didn't offer linguistics programs. So that narrowed the pool already. And I was also convinced that I was going to go to MIT and study with Chomsky, except I hadn't applied to MIT. And so that wasn't going to work. So I ended up narrowing down my college choices to one that had just formally announced the creation of a linguistics department. It was actually in the campus newspaper while I was doing my prospective visit. I thought, okay, this is a sign. And I met with one of the professors in the department, and he said, it's really unusual that we get high school students that are eager to do linguistics. Usually they figure this out after they take the intro course or something like that. I said, no, I want to do this, I know for sure. I ended up working very closely with him and the other professor in the linguistics department, who both work on endangered languages. That was my introduction, was through those two professors at Dartmouth College. My junior year, I worked on a project that one of those two professors was doing on a language of the Tungusic language family, which is spoken in Siberia. Perfect. I had Russian. A lot of the literature was written in German. Thought, okay, I'm going to do this for graduate school. I'm going to work in Siberia. I've got Russian. I got German. I can do this. There was this really cute guy that I went to college with. I met him in church, and first I wasn't quite sure, what this guy was about. It just turned out that he graduated before I did, and we kept in touch, and we traveled together, and then he decided that he needed to leave his job. He was working at IBM after he graduated, and go and work in Mexico. And I kind of thought, I don't know. I don't speak Spanish. I'm going to Siberia to do language documentation work. I don't know what you're talking about. But he was really cute, and I really liked him a lot. Good heart. And so eventually, over the course of 2.5 years, he convinced me to meet him there in Mexico after he had been there working already. So I worked on a language documentation project in college. A cute boyfriend was doing community development work in Mexico, and I was kind of like, that's not really my thing. I do language stuff. First he's like, well, you could work with the women on economic development, and I thought, yeah, okay, that's interesting. And then the second time he was like, how about you help them with business skills? Okay, all right, okay. So I got it. Third try, he was serious. He said, language documentation. The language spoken in the community that is in danger of being lost. Speakers are shifting to Spanish, and there's real need to write this down while speakers are still willing to talk about it. Okay, you got me. So I went to Mexico, and I was there for a year working in a small indigenous community where there's a variety of Nahuatl, which is Nahuatl is a large language family spoken in Mexico, had roughly 1 million speakers. But in this community of about 6,000, I would say less than half are speakers of that particular variety of Nahuatl, which is only spoken there and is not intelligible with neighboring varieties. So I worked with speakers there on making audio recordings and identifying ways that it was different from neighboring varieties, and was convinced that that this was my calling. And I applied to go to graduate school with the idea that I would do a language documentation project, this time in Mexico, right? Siberia to Mexico. I'm getting warmer. And that I would be planning that project in the community where I had done my volunteer work. I got into the University of Texas at Austin. They have a strong connection to programs in Mexico. They have a wonderful library of Latin American resources, language dictionaries, grammars, dedicated faculty to language endangerment and community involvement. And I thought, okay, this is the right place. I got there, and my first year there, this time I met someone who was adamant about making sure that the communities undergoing language loss were involved, very much involved, and in fact desirable of linguistic documentation. The model in linguistics for many years has been one language, one linguist. And the linguist goes and finds the language. Because linguists realize that there is an urgent need to document the languages of the world, which I will explain in more detail as we go along. But usually they choose the location. That was certainly the path that I was on, right? First I had chosen Siberia, and then I said Mexico. The person that I met was working in a community in Peru that had just essentially put out an APB saying linguists needed badly. The community was located in a rural area, a riverine area in the Amazon jungle of northern Peru. They had just experienced a pretty severe malaria epidemic and looked around and realized as a result of that that their numbers were dwindling. The community is about 300 people, and of those 300, about 25 are speakers of a language called Aikido. And so they actually flipped the model and said, instead of the linguists saying, we found this community, they went out to find the linguists. And they had found 2 graduate students at the University of Texas at Austin, and I was going to one of their events explaining what they do. And I thought, wow, they really have a model for how to involve the community in language documentation work. And I thought, I want to go and see what their model is about and apply it to what I could do in Mexico. Getting closer. So I started talking to them a lot about how they were working with the community, what kind of arrangements they had. They had actually signed a contract with community leaders describing what they would provide for language documentation work and what the linguists would provide and what the community would provide. Okay, I can really see this working in the community development model that I had been trained in as a volunteer in Mexico. Then they said, why don't you come with us this summer? No, sorry. Remember, I speak German and Russian, cold climates. It's fitting that I live now in Iowa. I'm good. Grew up outside Chicago. Can handle the winter. Amazon jungle, not so much. No, thank you. And they said, okay, well, if you change your mind, you let us know. And came back the second time, and they said, we've been thinking about it a lot. We really think you should come with us this summer to work in the community. We're looking for some graduate students to help with the documentation project this summer. Why don't you come? And I said, no. You might recognize a trend here. It takes 3 times to convince me. The third time they said, well, we've convinced another graduate student who was someone I worked very closely with, I really enjoyed a lot, and is now my daughter's godmother, so that worked out well. They said, this will be the arrangement, this is the team, and we really, really, really want you to come. We really think that you'd be a valuable addition to the team. And one of my professors at the same time said, Cynthia, you should go. So with those things then, finally I said, okay, all right, okay, I'll go. Part of the hesitation was the community, we sleep in tents on a concrete platform, and we bring all our food in for 8 weeks. That was something that even though I had lived in rural Mexico, we commuted between the city and the community, so that there was still the opportunity to take a shower. And so that was part of my hesitation. I was not sure about entering the malaria area. It's remote. It takes, depending on the speed of your motor, or the power of your motor, anywhere from 4 to 24 hours to get to the community. I've done that in 4 and 11, but never 24. So medical needs attention is filled by a small, essentially, health post. But if something serious were to happen, you're dependent on the boat to go downriver. So those were all real concerns for me, but I decided to go. Bit the bullet, overcame the fear, and said, all right, I'm doing it. So I went in 2004 for the first time, and absolutely fell in love with the language. Not the jungle, but the language. And so I came back from that experience and said, this is really important to me, and this particular community is really in need of language documentation, and this is something that I can do. All right, Siberia, Mexico. Now, I was not planning on Peru, but it just was an opportunity that I could not give up. So I ended up going 2 more times. That was what I wrote my dissertation on. working with the speakers in the community on essentially everything that we could figure out about the language. So, that was a 15-minute introduction to why I am qualified to talk to you today about language endangerment. But it also hopefully underscores why this topic is personally important to me. It's deeply wrapped up in how I decided that that cute boy from college should be my husband. My colleagues from Peru are ones that are very dear friends, and one included is the godmother of my daughter. And also the work that I have been doing since that first project in college has been a consistent track for me and my career. So this is something that is deeply personal to me, and an issue that I feel strongly convinced to be particularly important for this century. For all of us, including monolingual English speakers. So now, here's the other piece of why I think it's important to talk to you about it today. I have been given a seminar on endangered language documentation at Grinnell. I also did this topic as my first year tutorial this past fall, with the goal of making a persuasive argument to convince young college students that language documentation and language endangerment is an important global issue. And I don't think I've done it yet. I don't feel like I'm 100% persuasive, that I've really laid out a convincing argument. I've looked to other linguists to see what they say. I've presented that, and those are the types of readings that we do in my class. That just doesn't take hold in the same way. So I really was motivated to talk to you today to see if I can take a different tactic in being persuasive, okay? So, we count languages, and we believe that today, in 2015, there are 7,102 languages. Wow. When I looked up this number for my course in the fall, the number was 7,106, so it's gone down by 4 since August. What do you think the figure will be in the year 2100?
3,500.
3,500?
5,000.
5,000? 4,000? 450? Or 4,500? Or 4?
Sounds good.
Or 50?
I think it was 4,100.
2,100?
21.
Okay, so all our estimates are still in the thousands. So far, you have all decreased the number by half or more. That is, in fact, the prediction. So the prediction is that half of the world's languages will be no longer spoken by the year 2100, by the end of this century.
I have a question.
Yes.
How big a group is necessary to consider it a language group?
Great. So the question is, how many people do you have to consider it a language? I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. So my overview for today is that I really want to ask, I'm going to give you some more background to these numbers. How do we count a language? How do we know who counts as a speaker? So, and how do we figure out which ones are endangered or not? So I'm going to go into the numbers for probably the first half, and then talk about factors contributing to these numbers, why we should care, and what we can do. Okay? And I mean we in the inclusive sense, rather than we linguists. Okay? So, first thing, to be able to come up with a statistic like half of the world's languages will disappear by the year 2100, we need to say how many languages there are. Counting languages is actually a difficult enterprise. First of all, who counts as a speaker? So if you consider the language community that I described, where I said there's about 25 speakers remaining in a community of 310 people, how do we know that those are the speakers? Well, there's a number of criteria that we typically apply, but there isn't really a good metric. For monolingual speakers, it's very easy to identify what language that they are a speaker of. When we see humans get together, they create language. And if you only speak one language, it's easy to say you're a speaker of language X. But in situations of language contact where there are rates of bilingualism or multi-bilingualism, it's harder to say how to count someone as a speaker. The reasons for that is personal attestation is an important part of that decision. So do people consider themselves to be a speaker of that language? And that is a subjective measure, particularly for bilinguals. I did a class on language contact a few years ago where we had the language assistants that help with the language courses at the college. So these are postgraduate students that come to help with the language classes and from the countries where the languages are spoken. And in the class we were talking about, do you consider yourself to be bilingual? And one of the language assistants, who was fully capable of participating in class, the language of class was English. We were all able to understand her very well, and she was able to understand us, so there was no language barrier. She was there from Kazan in Russia, and as the Russian language assistant, and she was trilingual with Tatar, Russian, and English. And when I asked the question, do you consider yourself to be bi or multilingual, she said no. Even though she was fully functioning in English, Russian, and her native language, Tatar. She thought that she spoke Tatar and was pretty good at Russian and English, but didn't consider herself to be accomplished enough in those other languages to fully qualify as a trilingual or even a bilingual. Part of that is because language use is related to particular domains, and individuals might say, well, if I don't feel comfortable using language X in Y domain, then I'm not fully bilingual. The reality is that multilingual situations are the norm in the world, and there is no perfect balanced bilingual, someone that has perfect command of all domains with both languages, except for children that are raised bilingual starting at age 3 or younger. They tend to have full command of both languages, although sometimes even they will say, well, really I'm stronger in Spanish because that's what I do math in, or that's what I pray in, or that's what my dreams are in. And so there might still be a preference even for individuals that are raised in a true bilingual environment. So who counts as a speaker? Essentially, from a linguistic standpoint, someone who uses the language. And that's also challenging in situations of language endangerment because usually languages don't just disappear overnight. Rather, speakers decide to shift to another language, and that process will happen gradually. So there's gray areas in how we count speakers. Right? There's also gray areas in what counts as a language. Okay? Language, is it a dialect? Is it just how you speak because you're a little bit different? My students yesterday in class said, you're the only one on this campus that says your homeworks are due on Thursday. Everyone else has homework assignments. They pluralize the assignments, they don't pluralize homework. I thought, I had never noticed this about myself. I must have heard that somewhere before because I can't imagine that I innovated homeworks. Well, you're the only one. We've only heard you do it. So, do I have my own language because I pluralize homework in a way that no other professor does? Well, we do think of gradation in terms of qualifying languages. So, someone's individual variety would be their idiolect. We can think of small groups as having dialects. Those might differ by feature particular lexical items or pronunciation from other dialects, but all those will be dialects of the same language. and then distinct languages. Usually the criteria is it mutually intelligible with something else? So sometimes even determining whether or not something is a dialect is hard because speakers of two distinct dialects of the same language will actually not at all be able to understand one another, and that's much more likely to be distinct languages. Linguists usually avoid trying to count something as a dialect or a language and call everything the same. So they all use the word variety to essentially talk about something that is different from something else. So we might say the Grinnell variety as opposed to the Des Moines variety. It's also, in terms of counting, something that we need to keep track of across a very large space. So in describing to you the community in Peru where I worked and the difficulty with getting there, that makes it difficult to count languages and count speakers. We don't have an ability to open up a map and say, oh, well, there's this geographic area, there must be 10 languages represented here. The reality is that we have places of the world where there are pockets with lots and lots of languages, and places of the world where a single language is used across a large geographic area. So there's no way to predict how many languages will be spoken in a given geographic area. You have to go and count. And that is a difficult task, particularly in remote regions of the world. It also requires some linguistic analysis to determine whether or not it is in fact different from something spoken around the river bend. You also need to keep track across time. So the figure that I gave you for the number of languages in the world today, 7,102, that's of today. I told you in August the number was 7,106. And so going and counting is something that happens iteratively. It's not something where we can go once and say, we've got a good feel for how many speakers there are here. Really, it's something that is constantly in flux. For instance, in the community where I work, not this past November, but a year ago in November, one of the speakers that I work with passed away. So that affects the overall number of speakers and how we are able to count these statistics. One resource that has been particularly focused on this effort is something called the Ethnologue. And this is a database of the world's languages. So you can pick a region. So go to the continent of Africa, choose a region within there or a particular country, and see the languages that are spoken in that country. They do keep information about speaker numbers, but they also, remember, you're keeping track across space and time. So their statistics, so this is an extinct one, I didn't do that on purpose. But when they do the population, okay, they give you a date for that. So that is something that you can locate within time. How recent are these statistics? Okay? The Ethnologue also is working now, this is the most recent edition, to characterize the vitality of the language. So that is something here given in language status, 6A. Vigorous, so that means that the language is currently being used and being transmitted to children. That is, so essentially if we consider the distribution of languages in the world along a scale of 1 to 10, how vital or endangered are you? A characteristic of 6A puts you about the middle. Recently, in 2013, the editors of the Ethnologue did a bunch of number crunching to figure out what exactly is our prediction about language endangerment. They found that the number of languages to the left of the middle, so these are the ones that are vital, have vitality, so alive and well, essentially we could say. Those are fewer than the ones to the right, so it's between 6 and 10. It's close though. I think this is 30% and the other side is 32%. Now, one challenge with the ethnologue. Its roots in cataloging the languages of the world. I'm going to go back to the map here. It's actually in missionary work. The ethnologue is put together by a group called the Summer Institute for Linguistics, which is largely funded by Wycliffe Bible translators. And the motivation for counting the world's languages is determining whether or not there is a New Testament available to people that couldn't access it in another way. So there's two challenges with that. One is, and I would say, I hesitate a little bit because this is changing. The priorities of the organization have changed significantly in the last 10 to 15 years to be more oriented towards language documentation, and they are still very much grounded in their missionary history, but I do think that they are shifting away from those particular goals. But the original goals were to provide Bible translation. And so as a result, if a community was already practicing Christian religion, if they had a Bible in another language, that gave those communities lower priority in terms of language work. Language communities where there wasn't a high rate of bilingualism, where there was no Western religion introduced, those became higher priority. So as a result, the work conducted by the Summer Institute of Linguistics is driven not by how severe the language endangerment is, but how peril the souls are. And like I said, I believe that is shifting, but that certainly colors the history of the organization. It is really the resource that we have. No one has stepped up to provide an alternative to the ethnologue. There have been some efforts, particularly to catalog endangered languages, that I'll show you in a minute. But in terms of cataloging all the languages of the world, this is the most comprehensive resource that we have to date. Also, it's based on work that started in the 1950s and 60s. So they do have records that date back 50 years. And so they are able to say their observations about language loss over time. Okay. I showed you that scale of how much vitality the language has, and I wanted to show you something interesting about the distribution of these languages. So this is a bunch of numbers. Okay, so I want to tell you how to look at this. So this is dividing the world into areas, essentially by continent, telling you how many living languages there are, so that's how we get our 7,102 figure, and the number of speakers. Okay? The thing that I want to point out is the number of speakers in the Americas and the Pacific. Small numbers compared to, say, Asia. Okay? But then look at the number of languages in those regions. Okay? So in the Americas, we're talking 50 million speakers for 1,000 languages. So that is a lot of linguistic diversity for a small group of speakers. Similarly, for the Pacific, 1,300 languages, but fewer speakers, 6 million. Okay? resources for cataloging endangered languages, and the one has been put together by UNESCO, the Atlas of the World's Languages in Danger. Yes, here we go, okay. Okay, and this one you can search by area, and it was last updated January of last year. The one that I like a lot is the Endangered Language Catalog, which is at endangeredlanguages.com. This one has actually shows you the real-time count. So 3,205 endangered languages. And this is a growing resource, and they're actually, in addition to keeping track of vitality, the red dots are languages that are severely endangered, whereas the green and the yellow dots, are kind of in the middle. And the black ones, I forget what those are. I'll look at that at the break and tell you. But essentially, this gives us an interactive resource for looking at the distribution of these languages. And then you can go to a particular language, and they are working to also upload video data, dictionaries, grammars, so that if you had a particular language that you were interested in, you could go to this record and find materials about that language, or submit materials that you yourself had created. And they accept materials from linguists and from community members. Okay, I think this is a great point to take a break. I'll see you in a little bit.
Thank you for taking your chairs, ladies and gentlemen. Isn't it a treat to have somebody that has to worry about being too loud when they're talking? Now we'll get back to the second half of Cynthia Hansen's lecture.
Okay, when I asked you how many languages we predicted will be around in the year 2100, I wanted to highlight a statistic that was given in 1992, which really kicked off the linguistics field into the realm of language documentation. Prior to 1992, there was significant language documentation work being done, but a man by the name of Michael Krauss participated in a joint paper in Language, which is the premier journal for the field of linguistics, in 1992 about endangered languages. And his contribution to that, it was a compilation article, was called The World's Languages in Crisis. And he very much had a doomsday prediction, which was that he considered it a plausible calculation. At the rate things are going, the coming century will see either the death or the doom of 90% of mankind's languages. Now, that was a probably too advanced pronouncement. We saw when I showed you the Endangered Languages Catalog that the number they have that shows up was 3,205. And if you divide that by 7,102, you get about 45%. So 45% of the world's languages are currently endangered. That doesn't necessarily mean that they will all disappear in the next 85 years. But it is a staggering statistic. Furthermore, as I pointed out when I showed you the vitality scale, Simons and Lewis in 2013, they're the editors of the Ethnologue, the catalog of all the world's languages. They determined that there are more languages in some stage of language loss than languages in a state of vigorous use. They also took Krauss's figures from 1992 and tried to put more regional specifics to it, and they found that more than 75% of the languages that were in use in 1950, because recall the ethnologue work started in the 50s, are now extinct or moribund in Australia, Canada, and the United States. So the rate of endangerment is much, much higher in these regions, but less than 10% are extinct or moribund in sub-Saharan Africa. So that means language endangerment is dependent on region, and this is most likely due to the effects of colonization, particularly enforced colonization, where the colonizers were not at all interested in learning the languages of the people they were colonizing. Also in the 21st century, this is also probably due to rates of urbanization. As individuals move from remote locations to large cities for economic opportunities, they tend to shift to a dominant language of that region as opposed to maintain their first language. And as a result, we would consider some regions to be at great risk and others to be more safe. I say safe in quotes because if you recall when we looked at the scale, let's see. If we look at the this is the scale that they use. Okay, yeah. We'll use this one. I want the ethanol page. Where did it go?
It's become endangered.
It has. Okay, so this is the table, the designations that the ethnologue uses for determining a language's vitality. So a language with level 0 is widely used internationally between nations for knowledge exchange and international policy. That's how we would classify English. English is not in danger in today's society at all. The national would be the same, but at a national level instead of an international level. And we get down to the 6A and 6B side. So this is at the middle of the scale. So 6A is vigorous and 6B is threatened. They're right next to each other and they're the exact same number. 6A is the languages used for face-to-face communication by all generations and the situation is sustainable. Whereas 6B is that the language is used for face-to-face communication within all generations, but it is losing users. That is a point, that is a turning point that can happen within one generation. It can happen within 10 or 5 years. Even fewer if there is a situation of genocide or a natural disaster like a tsunami, where the individuals that were gaining education in the language lose their opportunity to learn the language. So it is a delicate line between that 6A and 6B as to whether or not a language is in fact vigorous or threatened. There has been some recent research by Gregory Anderson and David Harrison on identifying language hotspots, which is essentially taking the geographic distribution and determining where we should place our priorities. And this is what they have identified. The places in red are the most extreme situations or the most extreme hotspots because of high linguistic diversity. There's a lot of languages, but not a lot of speakers. And also they calculate amount of documentation work that has been done so far. So these regions in particular, the Northwest Pacific Plateau, so Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia, Central and Eastern Siberia, Central South America, and Northern Australia are in the most need of language documentation work. You might also note, though, that orange is Oklahoma. Oklahoma actually has a large number of languages with decreasing speakers and not a lot of language documentation. So this is an issue that is fairly close to home. It's not something that is just rampant in the Peruvian Amazon. Although you will note that Central South America is red. Okay, so I told you how this was calculated, and we talked about these regions. Okay, so one way to convince people is to give them a lot of numbers and say this is a big problem, okay? Sometimes that works. Hopefully it worked with you, and we'll see. Another way is to pull at some heartstrings. So let's try that tactic this time, okay? I have given you a list here of things that will be lost with the loss of languages. I want to go through each of them, but I'm really only going to give you probably one example for each of these. There are many more, so this is just a highlight of the types of things that can be lost. I could make a much more exhaustive argument in this area. So in terms of history, there is information that languages contain that are unavailable in the archaeological record, unavailable in the written record. For example, in Peruvian Amazonia, you can imagine the soil there and the likelihood of finding archaeological evidence. Okay? The Amazon basin is very biologically lush. Things decompose very rapidly. It's warm and wet, and things break down very quickly. I can show you my passport cover. I remember the gate agent going, "You got to take better care of this." 8 weeks, my passport cover was already starting to deteriorate. Archaeological record is very limited in the Amazon region. The extent of it is anthropogenic soil, so that's compost, soil that has been tampered with by humans, grouping together biological waste essentially, and carbon, so fires, so finding evidence of a fire ring or some charcoal evidence. Although there's been some recent work done on what I would say hybrid anthropogenic soil, which is, it's not quite compost, it is compost, but it's enhanced because there are layers of pottery shards within the soil, which suggests enough pottery to make layers of shards, which suggests lots of people. But that's all we got. And however, within the Amazon basin, there is a high rate of language diversity. Not just a large number of languages, but a large number of language families. And so what we can do is we can look at languages that we know to be related to one another and determine what kinds of words they have in common. If languages have a set of, that we know to be related, have a set of words in common, we can hypothesize that an older version of that language also had that word. And this is particularly useful for things that don't leave an archaeological record. So that would be, some examples have been determining whether or not groups had tobacco based on whether or not the word for tobacco was the same across a group of languages. Also, agricultural practices can be determined based on what types of words are used for domesticated versus wild animals. Or for plants that tend to be harvested through agriculture as opposed to gathered in the wild. In my own research, I've been looking at a counting strategy that is unusual. It's only attested in the Amazon region, and it's a particular strategy for indicating the number for 4. Working with a colleague, we have identified 49 languages representing 13 distinct language families that in the word for 4, sometimes 3, sometimes 5, there's some notion of having a brother or a sibling. So what does that mean? Well, if you look at the word for 4 in Aikido, the language that I work on, it essentially, it's a really long word. It's suwaramahitam. Okay? And if you look at the individual pieces, we can recognize that the starting piece means good, the middle piece means brother, and the last piece is with. Okay, so good, brother, with. Well, what the heck is that? It doesn't really mean anything in isolation. However, if we look at the other languages in the region and their strategies, they also have something like with a brother or with a sibling for the word for 4. Now, originally when I was working with my collaborator on this, she said this is related to marriage patterns in the region. It's very common to do something called sister exchange, where a brother-sister pair would marry a brother-sister pair. 4 is a salient number. 4 might be related to having a brother. I said, okay, I'll buy that, except the word in Aikido is actually same-sex sibling. It doesn't mean brother, it means brother if I'm a man, but it means sister if I'm a woman. So that doesn't work, that doesn't support a theory of sister exchange. And I said to her, what if it's related to how they count on their fingers? Because when my speakers tell me about the numbers, they say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And they group the fingers into pairs. So 4 has a brother or a sibling, same sex, same type, right? And 3 does not. And lo and behold, the Aikido word for 3 is bad brother with. Okay? And it turns out that if you look at these 49 languages across the entire region of the Amazon basin, that we see systems that are base 2, have a brother, not have a brother, 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 have a brother. Okay? And we see systems where 3 and 5 consistently are negated. So for Aikido it's the word bad, but for others it will be not brother. And so we see evidence that this strategy is the same across the region, even though the languages aren't at all related to one another. Okay? We're looking at the word for 3, 4, and 5. Right? 3 words. But as a result of that, we're now able to say these 49 languages were probably in contact with one another at some point in the past. Because we don't see this strategy anywhere else in the world, which suggests it's not something that popped up randomly 49 times in this little area. Because if it was random, we would expect to see it in Australia, in Africa, and maybe even parts of Europe. Okay? We don't see that. We see a base 10 system, right? Like 13, 3 and 10, or 30, 3, 10. We see evidence of numerals being put together, not lexical items being used for determining a number. Furthermore, we don't see this in Quechua, we don't see it in Aymara, which are major languages of the Western South American coast, the languages of the Andes. Okay? So that this is something that's happening in Amazonia. This points to a history of the Amazonian basin that is not present in the written record, because the written record dates back to the Spanish, 500 years ago, is not able to be found in the archaeological record. And now as a result, we have 49 languages to look at to see, okay, well, we see this similarity in the word for 4. Are there similarities in other parts of the lexicon? So the language betrays a history that isn't evident in the written record or the archaeological record, and may never be found in either of those things because they don't exist for this region. Okay. Existing knowledge about biological diversity. Did you have a question?
Yes. The language you're studying, Peru, is it strictly a spoken language and not written?
Great. So the question is this a spoken language, the one that I work on in Peru, or is it written? It is largely spoken. There is one speaker who is literate and has written things down, and it is written down by the linguists that work on it. But the majority of speakers are not literate, and so it's not. There's no written. The written records are from my work with my colleagues since the 2000s, and the SIL missionaries that were there in the 1960s.
But they didn't have it.
No. The majority of the world's languages are not written. So if you think of I've never come up with a good number. So some people have said 10% of the world's languages are written. So that would give us 700. That sounds about right to other estimates that I've heard. But it's definitely less than 50% written. Literacy, as you will learn in the next 3 weeks, is a learned skill. It is explicitly taught. Whereas spoken language is something that is acquired without explicit instruction. So they're differentiated in that way. Okay, imagine living in the Amazon jungle with lush vegetation, plants that serve all kinds of purposes, including the chemical compounds for most medical drugs currently being concocted. Imagine that those are at your disposal and the things that you use on a regular basis. It turns out then that you would make a word for the things that are useful. And language then gives us a way to capture existing biological knowledge. Individuals know about their environment, and that knowledge is cultivated over time. And as a result, we can use the words that they have for specific items to identify differences, because if there's a different word, we predict that there will be a different thing associated with it. So a great example is fish species. Much to my husband's dismay, I am not a fisherwoman, and they either look big or small to me. Maybe gray or green. But the river, where the community that I work in is located, has large fish diversity, and they are not differentiated by size. So you can see very different fish that are all the same size. So if I were describing fish alone, fortunately I have the help of some great fish books and my colleagues, I would say, well, the big fish is called this and the little fish is called this, but they actually have a very diverse vocabulary for fish that points to distinct characteristics that the fish have. So much so that the ichthyologists, which are biologists interested in fish, come to us and say, please give us your vocabulary lists so we know what to look for. And when the community members go fishing, we say, bring us back your haul, we'll take a picture, and you tell us what the word is. So while we aren't necessarily cataloging fish diversity, in capturing what the individual words are for these different fish, matching the pictures, we're able to pass this off to someone who knows how to look at gills and figure out size and mouth shape and eye color and things like that and say, oh, well, this is clearly a different species based on these criteria. Okay? And that's something that where the language knowledge aids in that process. Imagine having to do that from scratch. So what we know about biological diversity is lost when you lose the words for those items. Additionally, we lose topographical and geographical information, especially for remote areas. Have you ever used Google Earth? It's an interactive way to see the entire Earth. If you've used Google Earth for the jungle, the Amazon jungle, it's a bunch of trees. Part of the success of Google Earth is being able to get on-the-ground pictures of the regions that are being presented to you. And in the Amazon jungle, which is landlocked, the largest city in Peru within the Amazon, it's 500,000 people. It's the largest city in the world, inaccessible by road. You can't drive there. You have to fly there or take a boat. It's landlocked. They're stuck in the middle of the jungle. And going out from there is traveling by river. It's not really hiking, because as soon as you go away from the river, you're in thick, dense forest. Okay? Members of a community know their surroundings, and they have ways to describe how to get to different places. As they have names for locations that are salient to them. As a result, when you use the language, you lose those identifying characteristics, and you're at a complete loss for navigating an area that is impenetrable by satellite imagery. So we lose that type of knowledge, not just the geography, but also the topography. So how you get from one place to another based on elevation changes, what's the most direct route, and things like that. There's some really cool work being done in Alaska with speakers telling their oral histories. and mapping them in Google Earth. And so they'll give some identifying points. It'll be a story where someone went on a journey, and they'll say, and then they saw the Twin Mountains, or they went to the snow-covered plateau, or whatever. And they'll work with someone to map this in Google Earth. And as a result, you can see the journey of the story, and they'll say, yep, that's exactly what it looks like. But that's with the benefit of high developed Google Earth technology. In other parts of the world, it's not as well developed. Okay. Through all these things, I've given some examples of how we lose culture, cultural knowledge. So it's not just about the scientific knowledge. There's also ways that communities interact and practice religion, family structures, parenting, marriage, that represent the diversity of the human experience. And finally, this is the one that keeps me working, is that as we lose languages, we lose important data for understanding the human mind. Not all languages do the exact same things. If you've ever talked to someone if you've learned a language other than the one you learned first, you know that there's a different way to put the sentences together, or even a word that just captures it better, right? Imagine 7,102 data points for how to capture that a little bit better. We're severely limited if we only focus on 10, 100, even 700. There are so many ways that languages tell us about how this thing up here is working, that when we lose a language, we lose an important data point. Okay, so that was the emotional. So we did the numbers and the emotional. I'm going to briefly go through why they're being lost, but I really want to, in the time remaining, talk about what we as individuals can do. One reason that a language might be lost is speakers are in physical danger. So that is when the speakers are actually lost. So that's through maybe situations of genocide or natural disaster or disease, rampant disease. That is not usually the case that contributes to language loss. The typical situation are really the last three. So changes to culture, some sort of cultural assimilation. The example of urbanization is one where that happens as individuals move away from their non-urban environments to an urban center. Their cultural practices will shift, which means their language practices will shift. Language policies, it may be legislated that you can't speak a certain language in a certain domain. That is true in the United States. Students, even in 2014, have been punished for speaking Spanish in a local school, even if it's something as innocuous as thank you. And language attitudes. So language attitudes are things that we all have about language. Everyone has a language attitude. Some are positive and some are negative. It's typically negative language attitudes that contribute to language loss. That is something like, well, your language sounds really funny, or it's so loud, or so harsh, where the characterizations given to the language somehow make the speaker feel like they're not speaking a good or a proper language. This I did, this is what I just said. All right. On the flip side, what contributes to language vitality? This comes from a book called Language Death by David Crystal. This is one of the most used resources on the factors contributing to language death and some of the solutions. So Crystal says that an endangered language will progress if its speakers increase their prestige within the dominant community. You're all nodding, so I don't feel like I need to go into more detail. An endangered language will progress if its speakers increase their wealth relative to the dominant community. This is something that we've seen in the United States with Native American communities in developing casinos. That has created wealth, and oftentimes they use that wealth for education programs and language revitalization projects. An endangered language will progress if its speakers increase their legitimate power in the eyes of the dominant community. Very much tied to wealth and prestige. An endangered language will progress if its speakers have a strong presence in the educational system. When speakers have a presence in the educational system, they can advocate for language programs within the system or supplementary programs outside of the system that can encourage children to use the language, which, if you recall, was the difference between 6A and 6B. An endangered language will progress if its speakers can write their language down. Having a way to make a record is a way to give it prestige and value. An endangered language will progress if its speakers can make use of electronic technology. One of my favorite examples is of a language that was on the brink of endangerment until speakers innovated a way to text it. And the reason for that is that there was a large rate of migration to the United States for economic opportunities, but speakers were then removed from their speech community. Telephone calls were expensive, texting was inexpensive. As soon as, with texting each other in their native language, that created a domain for language use that encouraged use amongst the speakers. So while we might think of texting as the downfall of American English, it is actually a way that languages can be maintained and actually encouraged to be used. And this one I added. This isn't from Crystal. An endangered language will progress if children are encouraged to learn the language. That perilous line between sustainable number of speakers and losing users is in children ages 6 and under. Children learn, that's why I chose a toddler picture instead of, there were lots of superhero pictures of kids 6 and up, and I really wanted to get someone on the cusp of language development. Because having access to the language during that time period is what ensures language vitality. So, if we think about these factors contributing to language loss and contributing to language vitality, there are things that we as individuals in Grinnell, Iowa, United States, in 2015 can do. It might feel like a dire picture, something that's happening far away from us, but there are small things that lead up to big changes. We can support linguistic diversity. That means supporting environments where multiple languages can be used, or supporting individuals that speak more than one language. We can celebrate signs of language vitality. Text messaging is a beautiful sign of language vitality. It shows that speakers are creative, innovative, generating needs to talk to one another, okay? Using new symbols in different ways that then carry over into the spoken language. That's a sign of vitality because it's showing that speakers need and want to use the language, okay? Kids, teenagers, asserting their identity independent of their parents by using slang words and like, and words you didn't know existed, are demonstrating linguistic vitality. They're showing that their language is strong enough that they can distinguish themselves from the older generation. In situations of severe language endangerment, adolescents are essentially trying to learn the language from their elders, and so their speech is mirroring the elders rather than differentiating from it. So youth differentiating themselves from adult speech is a sign of vitality, something to be celebrated. We can also tackle monolingual language ideologies. I always get to this point when I teach my class with my students, and I say, I have a confession to make. As much as I try and convince you that this is an important issue, I know that there are organizations like US English or English First that are advocating for English to be the official language of the United States. I know that those are organizations that are supported probably by my students' parents. And so that is something that contributes, doesn't enforce necessarily, but contributes to a monolingual ideology, that there's only one way to speak and it must be through English in the United States. What we observe is that when humans come together, they create language. They want to be able to communicate with one another. And having a multitude of language options tells us a lot about how humans work. And enforcing a single language and only being able to speak one language limits those possibilities and horizons, rather than broadening what is possible. And then finally, we can encourage language documentation as a career, as a scientific endeavor, and as something worthy of funding. I say that because yesterday, the Linguistics Society of America, which is the organization that publishes the journal Language, the journal that is the premier journal for linguists and linguistics, they were on Capitol Hill yesterday advocating for social science research funding. So when you support social science research, when you tell your legislators and representatives to support and fund social science research, you are supporting linguistics and language endangerment. Most of language endangerment projects are sponsored through the National Science Foundation or other social science research funding programs. Because we're at the library, I feel it's important to give you some books to read. So I mentioned Language Death by David Crystal. I did check, these aren't held by the library, so you should tell your librarian. When Languages Die by David Harrison, he's one of the individuals that worked on the language hotspots, and he's also done a documentary called The Linguists that talks about what linguists actually do when they go into a community. He's written another book called The Last Speakers that was published by National Geographic that's a companion to the DVD. Vanishing Voices is in a similar vein, and Dying Words is a more academic work and focuses specifically on Australia, but the kinds of research that Evans is doing about language loss in Australia is so fascinating, because he's really talking about this window into the mind and what types of things these languages tell us about social organization, mental processes, and that book is really cool. So, with that, I will say, go forth and break down monolingual language ideologies.
Have new languages been added to the list?
Oh, good. That was a question in the break. Are there new languages? Yes. They are not at the same rate as language loss. There tend to be one every 5 years or so. The most frequent domains where we see new languages emerging are sign languages, because they will emerge in a population of genetic deafness, and that's something that can newly emerge over time. And also in situations of extreme language contact, we'll see new languages emerge.
Extreme language contact.
So that, like a group of people trading where they don't have a language in common, or a new situation of colonization, or even we might say what we call business English, which is emerging as speakers do business from a variety of language backgrounds, that the type of English that you use in that setting is actually different than what we usually talk about. I'm going to take one more. I know Joanne wants to give you concluding comments. Yes?
Can you give us a short list of some of the languages that are very apt to survive, and some of maybe the recognizable languages that are apt to disappear?
Sure. So the ones that I consider to be safe, English, Chinese, Russian, Japanese, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and German, Italian. So I would say the languages of Europe, but Basque is being increasingly less used. So it's not true for all languages of Europe. I would say all the languages of the Amazon basin are at risk for loss.
Thank you very much, Cynthia Hansen. We're so glad that you could come back again. And continuing on in this general theme, next week Jerry Lalonde will be talking about writing, history of a technology. I want to remind you, if you haven't signed up yet, you can do so on the table in the hallway. And turn on your cell phone, turn off your tea coil, enjoy this beautiful afternoon, and we will see you next week. Thank you again, Cynthia.